Yorana, bonjour, buenos dias, good morning. Very happy to be here and to learn from all of you. So thank you for having me today. I feel very privileged. I'll get right into it. So the research that I'm going to talk about today was part of my master's thesis that I conducted under the advisement of Dr. Jennifer Kahn. And this project was framed by questions about where and how chiefly power and religious ideology materialize in an interior valley on Moorea over the 14th to 18th centuries. To answer such questions, I've employed comparative archaeological and geospatial analyses to investigate the settlement pattern of 5 late pre-contact secondary centers in the inland Opunohu Valley. Oh gosh. There we go. So the 5 inland secondary centers in this study each sit on top of a ridgeline, and they are characterized through the aggregation of elaborate marae sites that are associated with shrines, specialized houses, and other high-status structures like archery and council meeting platforms. Here, I've used site maps, field notes, GPS points, and publications from other archaeologists who have worked in this area much more extensively than I have, like Roger Green, Jennifer Kahn, and Patrick Kirch, to georeference these secondary centers into GIS. And this was an effort to digitally archive all of these data. For convenience, I've labeled them here according to the biggest marae complex in each center. These secondary centers are clustered across 2 main sociopolitical districts in the interior valley that are distinct in topography, productive capacity, site density, and sociopolitical status. 4 of the secondary centers are located in the Tupururu district near the Belvedere parking lot, as many may probably know. And this area is characterized archaeologically as being dense with elite ritual architecture and high status houses. The 5th center, for comparative purposes, is in the neighboring Amahiti district, which is associated with an overall lower density of elaborate ritual architecture. I just want to mention each center is distinct in its architectural composition, material elaboration, and placement on the landscape. In thinking about how secondary centers developed over time, I prioritized the role that ideology played in contributing to their formation and cultural significance. Therefore, my research questions are informed by theoretical frameworks about the materialization of ideology and, by extension, the role of religion in constructing the multi-tier chieftainship of the late pre-contact Opunohu Valley. In this paper, I use settlement-based variables to explain the elite ritual political nature of these 5 centers. My approach challenges more traditional perspectives that uphold a strict inland-coastal dichotomy, and instead, I align with those who have focused on the ways that junior elites in inland zones intimately engaged with and capitalized on their local surroundings to instill structures of sociopolitical hierarchy. The settlement narrative that I propose is one that views social status and elite identity as being expressed locally and specifically through ritual and political architecture, and as being entangled with landscape values and cosmological belief systems. There are 2 goals of this research. The first is about addressing diversity in settlement, site type, and monumental elaboration styles. The second goal is to understand the material links between stone architectural features, religious activity, and the construction of elite identity. To address these goals, I first examined the range of architectural variation and site density in these 5 centers. I pay considerable attention to marae, of which there are 41 in this study. Among marae, I examine architectural style and size and the extent to which they share similar elaborations, such as the use of worked coral blocks for construction material or the addition of a step on the ahu. And the data for this part of this project largely come from existing publications and unpublished field notebooks and site maps. So for this reason, I will pivot here to focus on the data that I derived from my geospatial analyses. Using GIS methods, I have examined patterns of site clustering in secondary centers using nearest neighbor analysis, and I have examined the extent to which marae share similar orientations, visibility affordances, elevations, and aspects. Considering these multi-scalar variables together allows me to question the extent to which secondary center location is best explained by the conditions of the physical landscape, or perhaps by ongoing sociopolitical and ideological developments. So getting into my results, nearest neighbor analysis provides a statistical explanation to whether secondary centers and their sites are uniquely or similarly clustered across the landscape. Keeping in mind that nearest neighbor defines sites as significantly clustered when the p-value is less than 0.05, My results suggest that 4 out of the 5 centers are all significantly clustered. Next, hypothesizing that archaeological sites in general would be more meaningfully clustered than non-sites, I ran nearest neighbor on 5 sets of randomly assigned sites. And this confirmed the notion that a clustered site pattern is a broad spatial principle that drives the organization of secondary centers. Next, I recorded orientation azimuths, but I only did this for Marae with Oahu, which there are 28 in this study. This is based upon the understanding that priests and other individuals during ritual events would have faced or directly engaged with the Oahu. These orientation data allow me to question the extent to which Marae were intentionally directed toward topographic reference points on the landscape, such as mountain peaks, sacred trees, or maybe even cosmological events like sunrise. Orientations were first recorded in GIS using the measure tool because I couldn't go into the field for a while. But then later in July, I confirmed these data in person using a sighting compass. And interestingly, I found that the orientation data I collected in GIS is either exactly the same or only very slightly different from the data I collected in person. So while GIS cannot be a totalizing digital substitute for archaeological fieldwork, in this case, I am able to advocate for its utility in obtaining meaningful and precise data. Viewshed analyses performed in GIS represent the visible extent from the center of each marae. This variable complements my orientation data by suggesting that visibility and directionality to landscape features like mountain peaks, large boulders, and sacred trees may have inspired settlement location. I have also used viewsheds to address intervisibility between sites within and across secondary centers to inquire about the construction of public versus private space. The appeal of visibility modeling here is its ability to address the sensory experience of landscapes. However, I do remain cautious about the interpretive ability of viewshed data at small scales, especially like here, just because of the ways that in GIS space is super homogenized. After running all viewsheds on Marae, I calculated the area of each viewshed using the formula here on the screen. Comparing visibility experiences, as well as the sizes of viewsheds, can speak to similarities or differences in the ways that ideology, ritual practice, and social interconnectivity versus exclusion were materialized through location. And finally, I derived elevation and aspect data in GIS using a digital elevation model of Moorea to get a picture of how the physical natural environment impacted secondary center location. Specifically, elevation data helped me investigate whether more architecturally elaborate marae are located at higher points on the landscape, and more broadly, whether there is a positive correlation between density of ritual architecture and elevation. And this step was directly informed by ethnohistoric accounts that associate height with increased sacredness. Then aspect, understood as the directionality of the slope, is also considered for the ways that it generally speaks to conformity or divergence in site location, and perhaps the role that sunlight played to site location as well. Okay, all these factors, when we consider them together, they produce a narrative about the degree of unity or divergence in secondary center construction. While variation in architecture materializes differently depending on scale and the variable in question, there are some notable characteristics that are shared among these centers. For example, across all centers, there's a high density of ritual architecture when we compare it to a non-secondary center site cluster. Also, visibility to mountain peaks seems to be significantly related to marae location, as my viewshed modeling has revealed that all marae in this study experience visibility to one or multiple mountain peaks. Most marae in this study also share a similar aspect, being located on a slope that faces north to west. So it's currently unclear whether this is just related to the natural slope of the valley, or maybe to an organizing principle related to sunlight or shade. And such an inquiry would definitely make interesting follow-up research. But overall, these variables do point to the existence of some broader settlement principles that were shared among the people who inhabited secondary centers at the regional level. The points where secondary centers are different from each other, however, are interesting, and they provide an entryway into exploring the diverse modes through which sociopolitical and religious ideology were materialized among junior elites. At the regional scale, all 4 centers in Tupururu have evidence of specialized political architecture, like council meeting platforms or archery platforms. However, the center in Amahiti does not have any of these specialized forms. This upholds existing characterizations of the Tupururu district as being especially dense with ritual elite activity. Each secondary center also expresses a unique composition of site types and various extents of Marae elaboration, which raises questions about how idiosyncratic elite identities were forged through architecture. Various extents of worship practices are also represented at each center, namely through different extents of Oro-style Marae. The Oro cult was introduced to Moorea in the 17th and 18th centuries, and Dr. Jennifer Kahn, among others, has associated its introduction with increased socio-political hierarchy and unique architectural signatures for Marae, like the use of rounded worked loaf stone that you can see here. Some secondary centers in this study have proper Oro-style Marae. Others have imitation Oro Marae, which is regarded as the use of these water-worn cobbles instead of the properly worked loaf stone. Still, others have no Oro Marae at all. It is therefore intriguing to think about the different or absent expressions of Oro worship and how this relates to people's efforts to maintain traditional Moorean worship practices versus efforts to adopt new forms of ritual practice. 5 minutes? Okay. Perhaps, okay. Secondary centers are also located at different elevations on the landscape. The 125 site complex sits at the highest elevation in all the study. Again, acknowledging ancient Polynesians' associations of height with sacredness, this finding confirms previous work that identifies these sites in particular as being a highly ritualized and sacred space. Orientations of Marae are also closely shared within the secondary center, with no overlap in Marae reference points between centers. For instance, at the 106 center, Marae with Ahu share the exact same azimuth measurement of 332 degrees. 338 degrees. And I suggest that these Marae may be intentionally oriented toward Mount Rutui, the towering mountain peak that divides the Opunohu and Cook's Bays. Such a standardization of Marae orientation is convincing evidence for increased political centralization that accompanied the intensifying social hierarchical nature of the inland valley in the late pre-contact era. Alternatively, Marae standardization through orientation takes a different form at another secondary center. Here, as you can see, orientations are numerically super different, yet there does seem to be an intentionality here because the Marae are directed toward a large group of boulders that form a natural focal point on the landscape. This case could point to experiences of placemaking that emerged on the more immediate local landscape through orientation and the ritual practices associated with it. To be clear, the mere existence of an alignment toward a cultural natural feature does not prove that it was a primary determining factor for that orientation. Nevertheless, my analysis has discovered a pattern in shared Marae orientation and provides an explanation for it. Okay, finally. So in my master's thesis, I used these variables to construct a ranking of secondary centers to consider their different manifestations of sociopolitical and ritual authority. In this ranking, it was very clear that one center was at the top and another was at the bottom. However, I found that it was difficult to rank the other three because based on the variable in question, they fluctuated. So this simply confirms that people who lived in the inland valley negotiated ideology and sociopolitical status in diverse ways, through raw material composition, through placement on the landscape, and through shared orientations of ritual architecture. What I emphasize here are the various pathways to social power that are mediated through architecture and space. Therefore, I wish to set aside such a ranking to instead focus on how meaningful landscapes were created in the Opunohu Valley through the ways in which people embedded themselves into their physical surroundings and their broader cosmological understandings of the world through the secondary center. Effectively, this allows us to understand the junior elites who inhabited the secondary center areas in more holistic terms. They were not passive subjects to the power of the paramount coastal elites, but rather they were agents in their own right who constructed unique elite identities through intimate knowledges of space, place, and architecture. That's it. Maruru.